afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today on College Journey Conversations. It is our pleasure and honor to have Scott Ludos. Scott, you're going to have to help me out here, brother. The last name is a killer, and you've admitted it to me in conversation. So share a little bit about how you came about and what you do. Share your last name, please, Scott. And we're so glad to have you with us tonight.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. It is Scott Lutostanski. We'll start
There
there.
you go.
So I, not the first time, won't be the last. So I'm the executive director at State Street Education. And so what we are is we're a team of executive function coaches who work with college students all across the country. And so we work virtually with kids at, dozens and dozens and dozens of campuses all over the country, really supporting them so that they can be more effective students, so they can be more productive, so they can manage their work and their stress and really be successful in their college academic lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it about executive functioning that really attracted you to kind of focus in on that topic?
Yeah, well, so I kind of have a background that is sort of a hybrid things that landed me in the middle at executive function coaching, which is I was a special education teacher. So I taught special education in Chicago public schools. And while I was doing that, I started working at a private practice therapy office in the Chicago suburbs. And that practice specialized in working with gifted and talented students. And so they brought me on as like an educational specialist because the students they were working with, these really bright students that were underperforming, were having emotional struggles, were seeing a therapist, but they also needed direct academic support because that was such a sort of centerpiece of their struggle. And so I found myself doing that executive function coaching. I was at that practice for a long time. And so I eventually took the classes, got the degrees, the licenses, and became a therapist as well. Yeah. And so all this is kind of happening over the course of a decade. And so, eventually part of it was moving states and dealing with licensure and stuff. But part of it was just in working as a therapist with these young, it happened to be a lot of young men, but also some young women between, 15 and 22. I just was really empathizing with the kids and the families and like really gaining an understanding into how crucial that particular moment in their lives were and how it could really propel them forward if they found success or really throw them into a tailspin, or honestly just their success in college and how it impacted the way they saw themselves the rest of their life. And so as I was sort of transitioning out of the classroom and moving states, I decided, you know what, this executive function coaching piece, I really feel like is making a difference and really changing kids' lives. And so I wanted to, work with students and have a team that worked with students at that very pivotal moment in their lives.
That's amazing. And, I feel like, Scott, that executive functioning is kind of it's kind of a forgotten topic as it relates to high school students. It's something that I think most, I'm gonna go as far as to say, right? Most parents recognize as being present, but either don't address it or don't know how to address it, and kind of live in their own households and band-aid the issues as best they can to get through and get beyond and over whatever hurdle it presents.
Yep.
What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a phrase that and I hear this a lot when I talk to families too. It reinforces the phrase, which is like the parent is functioning as the kid's frontal lobe, which really means is the kid's going through high school, that parent is just doing everything. It's like, hey, I packed your bag, get in the car in 5 minutes, and then the kid shows up at what they need, and like everything is being done for them. And I think sometimes parents are aware of that and want to get out of that role. Sometimes they enjoy that role and don't. And so I do think it's a bit of that. I also think sometimes it's just hard to comprehend the idea that some of these things are difficult. So even something as simple as, you know, I get 8 papers throughout the day and I just need to put them in my folder, and I need to put them in the right folder in the right pocket and just be mildly organized enough to function throughout my day. A task like that might be really hard for a ninth or 10th grader. And I think that is really hard for parents to wrap their minds around too, when they're probably pulling their hair out like, can't you just do that? And it truly is a difficult skill for certain students.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, staying organized and knowing what step is next for them is often overlooked, and definitely having someone alongside of them like you to coach them through that process to really improve the proficiency of their day
Hmm.
is amazing. Now, there are some things I think in high school, as you and I have talked before, with regards to red flags that parents might want to keep an eye out for. And what these red flags might indicate is not necessarily that there's a problem, right? Although that may in fact be true, but also provide a red flag for future issues that might occur maybe in the college years. And of course, that's what we're talking about in terms of transitioning from high school to college. What type of red flags can be recognized in the high school environment that they can prepare for and be mindful of in the college years? So what are some of those red flags? Let's talk about some of those. Let's bring them up and let's discuss them.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a spectrum. So there's the,
Oh
and some of these things I'll mention are, we could just call them the obvious ones, but there's the obvious and then there's the not so obvious. And there's definitely a spectrum. And certainly what we're talking about today, I'll always point this out, is definitely not all students. There's plenty of students, in fact, probably the majority, who are able to function and get through school and manage. But obviously, I'll always point out, like, the students who are impacted by it are really, impacted, and it impacts, it kind of affects their academics. So I'll start with like some obvious stuff. How's that
yeah.
sound?
Yeah, that's
Great.
perfect.
And
What are some?
and I'm sure you can picture this with the students you work with too. So obviously the most characteristic the most obvious characteristics are like students who are just floundering. Phrases parents would use would be like a hot mess or something like that. I hear that a lot out of parents' mouths. Um, I really like to focus on like what are the skills that they're not executing, but it's going to result in missing homework assignments, not knowing what they have, losing things, forgetting things. I mean, these are all, in your world, I'm sure it's as a college counselor, the essay completion process, and initiating those tasks and just managing them and chipping through them. Like, that's I usually, when I talk to college counselors, that's kind of the most prevalent
Exactly.
one. Um, so those are the obvious things. Now, add a little nuance to that, like, since pandemic and sort of schools went virtual, and then they're kind of still trying to recalibrate of like, how much are we going to penalize kids, how strict are we going to be on deadlines and things like that. I have found that schools around the country have not bounced back. And so I actually think that these types of things have even become a little more under the radar.
Mm,
And I like to use the words the journey and the outcome.
mm,
And so I can talk to a family where they'll come in and say, "Hey, my kid got a 3.8 and did awesome and had a great semester, and they're here's their list of schools, and it's a great list of schools." But that outcome isn't really representative of the journey, which is really like,
mm.
my kid was a complete ball of stress. They had 35 assignments to do the last week of May. They were emailing teachers on a Sunday night for extensions. They were freaking out. They were, all the things that go with it. And so I think sometimes that can deceive parents or even teachers in terms of like, how prepared is a kid for college. Really focusing on what did that journey look like, and not necessarily even the outcome these days, because a lot of times the outcome ends up pretty good.
Right, right.
you know.
Now, does the journey does even though they have like this great list of colleges and that they're coming to the table with that, and that would be like the outcome, right? But does the journey once they get involved in that journey, does the journey end up changing that outcome at all? I mean, does what their improvement in these time management moments or these executive functioning moments of improvement, does that how does that impact the outcome?
In terms of them, like if they're improving their skills,
Yeah, yeah,
um, some of the things I'm going to mention are kind of hard to quantify, right?
sure.
But typically, when kids are managing and struggling and behind, like there's emotions that go with that, whether it's shame or guilt, or maybe if there's parents listening to this, they can think of a kid who was just like in survival mode and covering things up and hiding and didn't want their parents to see that, oh, that I turned that in, but the teacher hasn't graded it, that one will pop up. Like, I think there's that piece of it. So when students start making improvements, like sure, having development is going to improve the way that they're functioning, improve the way that they're getting things done and hitting deadlines. It also kind of has that like a rising tide lifts all ships, in terms of they're going to feel more confident, they're going to feel better about themselves, like they're really going to start to maybe engage more in school or connect, and things like that as well. And so, honestly, with some students, the skills are the most important. For some, it's just starting to feel better about themselves around school, and gaining confidence and starting to feel like I can do this and I can do this at the next level too. So it's a little bit of both. Maybe that's the former therapist in me, but
Mhm.
certainly when kids start feeling it and becoming more connected, um, you know, the results really follow.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. What are some other red flags that kind of come up? I know those you mentioned the obvious ones there. Maybe there's a few. Are there a few more obvious that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, and I like to use the term like students who are susceptible to executive function challenges in
Mm,
college. Okay, so really students who are more likely. Um, Again, okay, so another obvious one would be students with ADHD, because all the symptoms of ADHD, or not all, I shouldn't talk in absolutes, but many of the symptoms go hand in hand with executive function challenges. And so those students who have ADHD and are kind of learning, how do I manage myself in the way that I operate, and how can I get through high school successfully and eventually college? Um, Certainly, like, going to be a red flag, along with things like anxiety and depression. And like, we certainly see a lot of students who are struggling, maybe in the midst of a struggle with those, or even overcoming those, but it's still relevant.
yeah,
So those are some obvious ones. If Can I shift into some maybe less obvious
absolutely.
ones?
Yeah, let's do it.
Sure.
Let's.
So so I like to call this student sort of the high school model student, but it's the student who really has the high school model down. They're generally a bright kid who gets through high school pretty easy, and they're probably heading to a good school. Um, but then they kind of get stuck in their high school model, and it's less than ideal. And so, um, is this, I don't know if this is going to set the alarm bells off for parents, because they're like, hey, my kid is in calculus and getting a B, and they're in another AP and getting an A. But we find that the students that can't adjust to a college model of learning struggle their first semester. And so things like only studying the night before for 30 minutes, or even looking through, you know, the study guide in study hall the morning of a test, or just kind of throwing a paper together in the last hour or two on a Sunday night. Like, students who are kind of doing these things last second but are bright enough to get through high school, we don't always see that translate to college, because now it's like, okay, you have a midterm the first week of October, that midterm's covering 10 chapters, like, and we see this, but you know, popping in a study guide for an hour the night before a giant midterm isn't going to get the job done. And so, that's why I call it sort of this high school model. It's a student who's really efficient, but needs to up their game once they get on campus.
Yeah, yeah. So really what you're talking about is some degree of procrastination. And of course, that is like extremely prevalent among high school students. I mean, it's like their best friend. And in many ways in high school, you can get away with that. In many aspects, you can get away with procrastinating, waiting to the last minute to do things. You translate that I want to say skill set, right? That's not a good skill set to have. But if you translate that skill set over to college, just like you say, that midterm exam last minute, it's not going to hang. It's not going to
Yeah.
hang.
And I will say, look, I'll even throw out a disclaimer and say, you know what? Some students can keep doing that and they actually
Yeah.
will be fine. Many, but some can get away with that. The majority, though, it's small adjustments. It's not like reinventing the wheel, but it's kind of applying the skills, in a really like amped up way so that they're able to meet the demands of what college is putting on them. So, again, if a parent sees that, oh, my kid studies for the calculus test the night before and then he gets an 88, like it's not exactly a five fire alarm here. That's
Right.
okay, but I do think it's something to be aware of, or maybe even just something to talk about your student
Yeah.
with as they're heading off to college. Of like, these tests are bigger. You got to study 5-10 times as much. Like they carry more weight than an average calc test. Something to kind of just watch for, I think.
Right. Right. Good stuff.
Yeah.
What next do you have?
Um, Students who kind of the charmers, we'll call them.
Okay.
Students who are charming, having a big dramatic personality is an amazing trait to have. When it comes to school,
Love it.
it can be a double-edged sword
It is.
because you're laughing. Maybe you're thinking of a student.
Well,
Um,
I'm actually thinking of myself, right?
yeah, yeah.
I was in high school. I was a charmer. I got away with so many things that I charmed my way through it. So that's why I started chuckling.
Kind of like I was talking about schools not bouncing back with the penalties and things like that on students and that masking sometimes the journey. I think the charmer can do that too because they're very self-sufficient and they know how to talk to teachers and they know how to get deadlines extended and maybe a retake on a test or whatever. Um, and they can use that to their advantage and it can mask, oh, I'm actually struggling. I'm actually, again, the outcome's not showing it, but I'm pretty far behind on these things. Or I have a lot of missing assignments, but it's okay because the assistant baseball coach is the teacher and he likes me and I already talked to him and I have a few friends on the team. It's all good. So I think those students can also like kind of throw the parents off the scent, for instance.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that carrying your way through it is it's a skill. Most
Hmm.
definitely. But yeah, I can see where it definitely can mask a lot of issues that would go otherwise unnoticed. And I don't, thinking about my days in college, as a Scott described charmer, right? I'm not sure that worked very well for me in the
Hmm.
college years. Uh, Professors are a little bit more um, less moving. Like they've got their feet firmly to the ground, and a rule and a regulation is a rule and a regulation, and there's typically no moving of extensions or that sort of, I mean, office hours are office hours and it's nothing before or after, right? So
Hmm.
um so I get that. I get that where that's going to translate into something a little bit more challenging in the college environment.
Yeah, I mean, that can be an eye-opening experience for students when they send their first email saying, "Hey, I didn't do this, but can I get it to you by tomorrow?" And then the teacher says, "No,
Nope.
zero." I do
Okay.
think these days, I will say I will say there's a correlation between how small a school is and
Uh,
how flexible they are. The smaller
yeah.
schools are more flexible. Um, we work with some students at small schools, but we work with a lot of students at big state schools. In fact, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. We work with plenty of kids down the street here at UW. And yeah, those professors, they don't
They
care.
don't budge.
No, the deadline is the deadline. And so yeah, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Cool deal. What's another category you've got?
Um to this is this is an almost I wouldn't even classify this as high school behaviors, but um students just making a huge adjustment.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's from rural to a city or even just a small town to like a big time campus, where all of a sudden, oh, there's 40,000 students. I'm at Ohio State. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. Um, so, or sometimes it's maybe a going to an elite school who's not used to being in that elite environment because maybe that's not the socioeconomic sort of class they grew up in, and it's a bit of a
Right.
culture shock. So, yeah, this is kind of veering more towards the emotional side of things because I think there not I know there's such a strong connection between emotional functioning and confidence and the executive functions and how they're able um to fire throughout a kid's day and week. But students making that big adjustment, I think that those parents should really be um pretty aware of not only is there the challenge of meeting what's being thrown at the kid academically, but also just like how they're engaging in campus, how they're feeling comfortable, how they're connecting with others, things like that. Um, I think it's important for people to be aware of that. I don't know if you can think of a
Oh,
student who's made a big adjustment like that.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm thinking of students who are, and it sounds like what you're talking about are students who are having a difficult time or may have a difficult time making these transitions. And it may be an environmental transition, a locale transition, a population transition, a roommate transition, because they may go from like not having a room to their self at home to
Yeah.
now having, a suite of four or maybe even a room of two, and having to get used to someone else making noises in the middle of the night when they sleep and them not used to having any, right? So
Yeah.
these transitional moments are really huge. And I remember like in my college days and getting my degree as I did in college student affairs, um, learning and experiencing, the student affairs office making decisions for room assignments, right? So students would come to campus, they'd get their room assignments, they'd move in within a week. There's major conflict, and so or something's going on, and they're back to the student affairs office saying, "Look, I can't stay in that room anymore," right? And they're wanting
Hmm.
to relocate. And what's really happening is they're having a difficulty with transition. Something is now out of the norm, something's not as they are used to, and they need to or think they need to change and get back to an environment that's most comfortable for them. The student affairs office doesn't always see it that way, right? They're like, well, unless there's like some life-threatening issue at hand, you probably just need to learn how to deal with this, right?
Right.
It's
I
a
mean,
learning moment that needs to take place, not a flight moment, but a fight moment to really to grow, have an opportunity to grow and learn from the experience. And so they would literally deny those transitional opportunities. Like, you need to stay with your roommate, you need to learn what's best there. And but what we see there is a transition, that they're unable to kind of cope with and understand how to process. And I assume that's what exactly you're talking about in terms of these different experiences.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, the school just, they'll just see it as a logistical issue.
Correct.
But on that, the students who are more likely to struggle with that are the students who don't engage in the housing process, or they don't fill out a survey, they're not looking to find a roommate. And part of that could be because they aren't, they don't have confidence in their social skills, or it gives them anxiety, or for whatever reason. They're also the students who are more likely to struggle with that roommate issue too. So that's how I see it. The students who are, there's certainly
Right.
students who are hungry to get to college and are like, I want to live with a guy and I want to make sure that he's saying he's going to rush a frat and like that's our room. I do find the students more withdrawn from that process, or just like, I'll just get someone, whatever. They then end up having the challenges. Now, part of that could be because they didn't get engaged in the process. Part of it could just be that socializing is naturally difficult for them. But
Right.
whatever the reason, that's how I see it played out. So, to bring this full circle to like, well, how is that a red flag? It does concern me when students aren't engaging in the roommate process and aren't even putting an ounce of effort into it, or try to find someone more similar to them, because if that works out, it's going to help.
Right. 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 Let's take a journey into the classroom for a minute. When we're talking about students, and of course, we're making an ultimate transition from high school to college, but when we're in the classroom, academics are going to obviously look a lot different, right? That high school classroom, whether how it's delivered and or received, is very different than how it might be delivered and or received in the college years, that college classroom. One of those executive functioning moments that tend to really have a twist, right, is how it is students are walking away with the content they're receiving from the professor, whether it be through lecture or video um, or whatever the scenario of delivery is. Um, if they're not used to taking notes in high school, which many high school students are blowing through the classroom without note taking, right? I
Hmm.
mean, because they don't really need it. They get a test review kit, before the test, which has everything they need to know on it. They just show up, right? I mean, there's exceptions to that, but in general, high school students are just not being taught how to take good notes, right? What's important to be to go on paper, so to speak, or in the computer, right? Whatever they're taking their notes on, so that I can learn from it and really have the ability to regurgitate that later in a test, quiz, or otherwise. When they get into college, note taking can be a huge crutch. Like, I shouldn't say crutch, like they'll need a crutch, right? Because
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
going to
yeah.
cripple them, right? They're going to need something to assist on making those note-taking opportunities more available. Now, unfortunately, I think, and I say this unfortunately, there may be some crutches that are being introduced to our society now through AI and other formats that are going to assist in maybe them collecting that data. Um, but the skill set of taking notes is definitely something that is a hindrance, like, because they just don't have that skill. So how do you see that playing out in terms of a red flag?
Yeah. I mean, certainly let's get to college and say I was never taught to take notes.
Yeah.
I'll also acknowledge what you're pointing out, which is, I always put it this way: the gap between high school and college is widening.
Huge.
High school is changing a lot.
Yeah.
College, still, there's note taking, tests, papers, exams. I know there's some other things thrown in, but it's just not changing at the same pace as high school. And so that gap is growing. Um, Maybe a more unique view on note taking. Number one, yes, it's necessary. Um, Number two, you pointed out something that I actually think a lot of students misinterpret, which is you said they need to take these notes so they can regurgitate it later. Um, that is correct. I think a lot of students misunderstand that, and the students that we work with, you know, this is all coming from their mouths, but like they think the purpose of notes is to leave the classroom and understand everything.
Oh,
Yeah. So you put is the true goal, which is um take notes so that we can write the important things and learn them for later,
right,
right? That is
right.
truly the goal. And so
Yeah.
students start off with in a lot of cases the wrong objective. In terms of learning how to take notes, it's kind of there's two parts to it. Number one is they need to learn how to take notes. That's the part I think is really easy. In fact, we find that with a couple 15 to 20 minute, literally a couple, like two 15 to 20-minute practice sessions, students are good.
Sweet.
Like it doesn't take much. It just almost takes validation of like, you're taking good notes. Obviously pen and paper are better than computer. Um, but it is a skill that most students, especially the students we're working with going to, you know, UC Boulder, like they can take notes pretty quickly. And in many cases, it's just better for attention, to be honest. They're gonna be more attentive in class. Um, and then the second part, and what I think is actually the true challenge of students is having the self-regulation and the consistency and the attention to do it. And that is where, you know, in our role, I can say it's easier because we can set goals with students um, to review their notes and see how they're using them as well. That's kind of the last piece of it is how are you using your notes?
Yeah.
But to me, it's always the biggest challenge is are you consistently taking notes? That's really what it comes down to. And so certainly in high school right now, kids are not being asked to take notes. Um, that is a bit of a red flag. If there's a student who literally has never taken a note all the way through high school, like, yeah, I'd be a little concerned about that because again, it kind of falls into that high school model I was talking about of, you know, that's not going to translate. You need to up your game. You need to change the way you're doing things. And so
Right.
that is definitely a red flag is like those students who aren't taking the notes in high school, they just don't have the skill. They're not used to it. I love when I hear like, "Hey, my AP US history teacher collects notes before each test." Like, that's great.
Right.
Um, that's great. I'm sure the teacher's not sitting at home reading every page of notes, but just the fact that they require it is like the little step that's needed.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean that is certainly a concern because college so heavily relies on taking notes to do well and excel.
Yeah. So is this something you mentioned earlier that, 10, 15 minutes of really close training can really revolutionize what you do as it relates to taking notes. So is this something that you do for families or for students?
Yeah, we do. We do what we call like a transition to college boot camp or a
Okay.
workshop. And so students come for a few hours, and one of the things we do is note taking. And so we have them practice and more importantly, kind of understand how notes are used in college. Sometimes it's just I call it like students need to reestablish their baseline for what a week looks like.
Got it.
And so all the things I'm talking about, these red flags of mismanagement and the high school model and getting out of that, like students need to reestablish when they get to college, this is what happens in a week. And
Yeah.
one of the main things that has to happen is what I call academic tasks, which are anything not connected to points or a deadline or a submission. Note taking is a perfect example. Using your textbooks is another good example. And so students need to understand like these are part of my new baseline. This is how I will be successful is by doing these things.
Awesome. Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
maybe we'll get a chance to witness some of that right here at Capstone Educational Consultants. Hopefully, we'll have another conversation in the near future about this or other topics. And it was truly a pleasure to have you today, Scott. These red flags are amazing and definitely something to keep an eye out for every single day in your teenage household, right? Especially as
Yeah.
we're looking forward to college. So it's a pleasure having you, and we'll definitely get you back on here again to do some more discussions and maybe some workshops too. Thanks again for joining us here at College Journey Conversations. Appreciate you.